Hey, it's Kat, and I'm back because what once was will be again. And I got my thinking cap on because we're going to use some history and some mythology this time to divine the mysteries of the Game of Thrones. And we're going to talk about Euron and who Euron is in Greek mythology and some other stories. So the dudes over at Game of Thrones Academy did a neat little video on who Euron is. They compared him to Odysseus because he was gone for 10 years. And he went on faraway trips to interesting and exotic places. And then he returned just in time to find a woman who was actually his wife in charge of his kingdom and not doing such a good job. And she was being assailed by all these men who wanted to be the rulers of his kingdom. And the challenge was they had to string Odysseus' bow, and only Odysseus could string this bow because it had to be strung in a certain way, and thus proving who was the strongest. And Odysseus did in fact string this bow, and it set about killing all the suitors, by the way. So there's a little Odysseus. He's also a couple other Greek folks rolled into one. For instance, he's talking about building 1,000 ships, and when he gets over there, he's gonna beep to Daenerys, and she's gonna make him his king, her king. Well, who that is Agamemnon and Menelaus. They're all wrapped up into one because, in fact, Agamemnon and Menelaus were two brothers who had taken refuge with the king of Sparta, who had a beautiful daughter, Helen. You might know her as Helen of Troy. In any event, whoever got Helen's hand would rule the kingdom of Sparta. Well, there were so many suitors, including Odysseus, this is before he met his wife Penelope, that they were afraid there was going to be this war. So they decided they would make a pact, and they would agree whoever got Helen as their wife, that the others would all protect them against anybody else, just in case. So they drew straws, and Menelaus got the short straw, and Agamemnon got as his consolation prize Clytemnestra, who later killed him, by the way. But in any event, Menelaus and Helen got married. It wasn't all that great. Paris came along, took her to Troy, and started the Trojan Wars, which you might be familiar with. And Agamemnon got together 1,000 ships, and they sailed to Troy. When he got there, the war went on for a little while, and it had to wait. And his men got restless, and they all wanted to go back home, so he burnt his ships to keep them from leaving. And you might know that later they used the wood from the ships to build the Trojan horse and go into Troy. So, who is Helen? Well, it's Daenerys, because just like Euron, she's playing many parts. So she might be, as the Game of Thrones Academy gentleman pointed out, Genghis Khan at the head of the Dothraki/Mongols, sweeping down out of the east. But at the same time, she's also Helen of Troy. And she's one other character, which we'll talk about in another video. In any event, Euron is also somebody else. And his name, Euron, is also the same as Euros or Eurus. And Eurus, in Greek mythology, was the god of the east wind. As you might have heard in the movie, or the series, Euron is said to have traveled to the far east. He went to the Jade Sea, and maybe Yiti and Ling, and all those exotic eastern places. And according to Greek mythology, the east wind resides in the palace near Helios, the sun that rises in the east, and he comes out of the east. And the east wind is an ill-omened wind because it brings rain and clouds to cover the sun, and it makes the oceans thrash. Now, the story of Eurus, the east wind, includes the fact that he had 3 brothers. And he and his 3 brothers at one time roamed the world just at will, and stirred up trouble everywhere they went, making things crash and civilizations fall, etc., etc. So Zeus grabbed them up and locked them behind a mountain and gave a guardian and said they could only come out whenever the gods granted them their release. Well, apparently the gods have released Euron. And one time when Euron was released, he caused a humongous storm because Euros is the Storm King. And the waters were thrashing and they were wiping out civilizations. And Poseidon finally rose up out of the sea and said, "Enough of this shit." And he sent a giant wave that inundated Eurus and sunk him into the ocean, thus calming the storm. And then he was dragged out of the sea and put back behind the mountain. So what do we think this means for Euron? Well, there was one other pretender that was actually in one of the trailers. So we see Bran having a vision of a dragon that seems like it has a rope tied to it and it's dragging something. In the history of Westeros, the Blackfyres were the bastards of the Targaryens. And they rose up a rebellion. They had a bunch of ships over in Volantis, and they were getting ready to invade Westeros. So the Targaryens sent a couple dragons and riders to go and deal with the situation. And as they were attacking the ships with fire, one of the Blackfyres said, "Don't worry, I know the secret of how to deal with the dragons." And they harpooned the dragon, tied to some ropes, and dragged him down into the ocean. And of course, when it went down into the ocean, it took the ships with it. And everybody on it. Including the rider. So, what do we think this tells us about Euron? Well, if he is Euros, the East Wind, who gets drowned by the god Poseidon, and we have this vision of the dragon that reminds us of the history of the last rebellion, that including the sinking of the ship with the dragon, we think that Euron will try to harness the dragon, either to pull him forward or just to control it himself, and he will be doing this in a storm and it will take him down into the ocean. Do I think he dies? I don't know. Because most of the time these things act as catalysts to bring out the next persona. So we'll have to wait and see. But there are some other historical, mythological facts that might tell us some other things that might go on at this, with this event. So, Game of Thrones Academy compared Daenerys to the Dothraki. They were compared to the Mongols, and according to history, the Mongols tried to invade Japan twice. Both times they were defeated by the Devine Wind Kamakazi, a giant tsunami that wiped out their fleets, thus saving Japan. And we know some other history that would actually be the Spanish invasion of England, or their attempt. So they tried twice to get together a great armada. And this armada at one point was in Cadiz Bay, and the English pirate Francis Drake came with his ships and set them all on fire, sort of like in the Bay of Marine. Then the Spanish got together a second great fleet. But before they could get underway, the leader, the Duke of Parma, died. And he was the great general. He was the good leader. So they had to look around for another leader. There was this other guy. Maybe he was okay. But in any event, by the time they got underway, it was storm season in the Channel. And as they were trying to go across to England with this great fleet, a storm came along and pretty much wiped out the fleet. Some ships went back. Some ships were crashed on the rocks. A few sank. Some made it actually to England, where most of the potential guys were either killed or, arrested and probably executed later. And some actually went around the north of England, ended up in Ireland, where they married into the population, and there may be Spanish blood in Ireland to this day. So that tells us the other part that might happen. There might be some sort of delay that brings them to the point where they do meet up with the storms in the Channel. And last but not least, so some of the ships might make it to Westeros, but who's going to be in these ships? And we did see the little shadow of the dragon flying over King's Landing. Well, another mythological story is that Euros is actually a feminine aspect, and that she and Ares, the god of war, mated and created the Amazons. So the Amazons were created from the east wind with the god of war, and the Greeks believed this to be true because these were probably Scythians, horse people from the steppes, and they did come out of the east and they raided the Greeks' cities continuously. At some point, the Scythians were pushed west into Europe by the Persian invasions, and they may have crossed the Channel and gone to the Isle of Skye. Now, the Isle of Skye is off the northeast corner of Scotland, and if you look at the Westeros map, it's a lot like Skagos. And in fact, at one point, it was called the Isle of Scatheg, the goddess of shadows, and it was the Skagath, the Isle of Skagath. I'll have to look that one up. But in any event, this is the great island of shadows where Cuchulainn, the great Irish hero, went to be trained by the warrior goddess Scatheg in the arts of shadow war on the battlefield. And if you catch my video about Rickon, who went to Skagos, we don't know if he's now in Ramsay's Keep or not, but that might be an imposter, or he could have learned something when he was on Skagos, because Cuchulainn was very young when he went. And I will do a different video about him, but in terms of the potential the Scythians come, or the Dothraki, or the Amazons, because they are the children of Ares and Euros. And Daenerys is also Ares, the god of war, which is unreasonable, has no reason, and just knows to make war. That's what she is right now, Genghis Khan. And she's Helen, because Helen is like Genghis Khan. Helen was the destroyer. She destroyed Troy with her decisions. Ah, there you go. So there's some ideas. Tell me what you think about that. I really suggest that you go and read some history and mythology that might tell you some of the other things that will go on. So we're going to get Euron probably going down in the sea while he's doing crazy stuff. And we may get some women warriors, or what's left of the Dothraki, landing on Westeros and joining Boudica / whoever Daenerys is going to come out as when she lands there as a warrior band of females. That one is just a guess, but we'll see. Thank you very much. Have a great one.